humanity's oldest and most brutal invention. War. No matter how far we think we've come in taming this beast, it always shows its ugly face again. We have not overcome fighting each other, and perhaps we never will. My name is Jeanne d'Arc. At 17, I wore armor and led men into battle. It was centuries ago, but the question I carried then is still asked now. Going to war, to combat, demands endurance, discipline, and often a frightening ability to shut off compassion. For as long as we can remember, these have been called masculine virtues. War was men's work. But is that really true? Haven't women always been fighters too? In today's so-called fifth wave of feminism, the debate has returned with force. Should women take up arms, shoulder to shoulder with men? Or does pushing women into combat ignore their strengths and even their best interests? That's why we're asking 3 questions in this series. How common was it throughout history for women to fight? We'll show you examples stretching back thousands of years. What do current debates and laws tell us about women in combat today? And the most pressing question, do women have to fight? This is part 1, and before we can argue about today, we have to start in the past. So let's answer the question, how common were women in combat? That's the story I want to take you through today. And since I don't need to charge into battle here, I thought I'd wear something a little more comfortable. Oh yeah, that's better. Where was I? Right, fighting women. In this video, I'm your guide. Think of me as a kind of time traveler, yes, built with AI, carrying you through history. Not to glorify war, but to show you what women actually did when wars came for them. Because here's the thing, when we talk about war today, we rarely talk about women. It's still assumed to be a man's duty. And yet, history keeps whispering back. Women were there, sometimes as leaders, sometimes as soldiers, sometimes as the last line when no one else was left. That makes you wonder, was my story an exception or part of a much bigger pattern? And if women have fought before, another question follows. Did they actually want to, or were they pushed, pressured, or simply surviving? And finally, the question that matters most for our time. Not do they fight, not do they want to fight, but do they have to fight? With shrinking populations and smaller armies, maybe the choice won't be ours anymore. This is part 1. Do women fight? We'll start in the past, with bones pulled from the earth, proof of warriors we thought were myths. Let's begin more than 2,000 years before my time, in the wide-open grasslands north of the Black Sea. For centuries, Greek writers told stories of Amazons, fierce women on horseback, shooting arrows, living free of men. Most people thought they were legends. But then came the graves. Archaeologists opened burial sites of the Scythians, nomads who lived from Ukraine to Kazakhstan. And what they found was shocking. Nearly 1 in 3 warrior graves belonged to women. These weren't ceremonial burials. The skeletons showed battle wounds, broken bones from combat. Some were buried with bows still by their side, daggers across their hips, and riding gear ready to use. The myth of the Amazons wasn't fantasy after all, it was anthropology. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could women fight on horseback in brutal steppe wars? Well, here's the thing. On the steppe, survival depended on speed and skill, not raw size. If you could ride and shoot an arrow at full gallop, you were valuable, man or woman. It makes me wonder, when survival is at stake, do we naturally rethink what women can do? Because the Scythians did. They didn't argue about gender roles, they buried their daughters as warriors. Yeah, I know, I'm not real. At least not in this version of me. But here's what is real. The people behind this channel. They put their time, research and passion into bringing these stories back to life. So do us a favor, talk to us in the comments. What do you think? What did we miss? What should we tackle next? And if you like what we're doing, hit subscribe. It helps more than you think. Alright, enough of me breaking the fourth wall, let's get back to history. Let's move forward nearly 2000 years. France, 1429, my time. The English occupied our cities, the French crown was crumbling, and into that chaos walked me, a teenager with visions, a stubborn will and not much else. I was 17. And I told hardened knights to follow me into battle. They laughed at first, of course they did. But when I rode with them, when I stood at the front, something shifted. We lifted the siege of Orléans, we pushed back the English. For a moment, the impossible seemed possible again. Now, don't mistake me for a symbol of equality. I wasn't there to prove a point about women's rights. I was there because my country was burning and no one else was stepping forward. But the fact remains, a girl led armies, and it worked. And here's what I want you to notice. When survival is on the line, people don't care so much about gender. They care if you can win. Just like the Scythians, my story suggests the same truth. Women fight when they have to. Now let's move closer to our own time, the 20th century. 2 world wars that swallowed whole generations. And in both, women weren't just nursing the wounded or making shells in factories. Some of them fought. In Serbia, a young woman named Milunka Savić cut her hair, disguised herself as a man, and took her brother's place when he was called up.
They said the Great War was a man's war. But let me ask you this. What happens when a sister refuses to let her brother go? It was 1913, in Serbia. My brother received a draft letter for the Balkan Wars. I cut my hair, put on his uniform, and marched to the front in his place. At first, no one noticed, but soon the truth came out, and by then, I had already fought. When the First World War broke out a year later, they tried to push me into nursing. I refused. I belonged in the trenches, and so I fought. Through mud, smoke, and blood, side by side with the men. I was wounded 9 times. Once, I collapsed from shrapnel in my chest. They told me to go home. I refused again. By the end of the war, I had more medals than any other soldier. The Legion of Honor, the Cross of St. George, the Medal of Miloš Obilić, from Serbia, from France, from Russia. I am Milunka Savić, a farm girl who became the most decorated female combat soldier in history. And maybe the better question is, why did it take the world so long to remember me?
She fought in at least 10 battles, was wounded 9 times, and became the most decorated female soldier of the First World War. When her commanders discovered she was a woman, they tried to reassign her. She refused. They let her stay. In the Second World War, the Soviet Union went further than anyone. Women became snipers, machine gunners, and pilots. The Germans gave one group of female pilots a nickname out of fear, the Nachthexen, the Night Witches, because they cut their engines and glided silently before dropping bombs. But here's the contrast. The United States, Britain, and Germany, women were essential, but not in combat. They served as medics, code breakers, ferry pilots, resistance fighters, factory workers. When the front lines were drawn, women were still mostly kept behind them. In the West, the idea of women fighting directly was the exception, not the rule. So the pattern repeats, from the steppes of the Scythians to my own battles in France to the trenches and skies of the world wars, women fought. Not always by choice, not everywhere, and rarely in equal numbers. But when survival demanded it, they stepped forward. So, what have we seen? From Scythian graves to the siege of Orléans, from the trenches of Serbia to Soviet night raids, women have fought. Not always, not everywhere, but enough to remind us that war was never only a man's story. And yet, history only answers the first question, because it leaves us with another. When women fought, was it their choice? Did they step forward out of conviction, or were they pushed by desperation, by duty, or by the men around them? That's what we'll explore in part 2. What do the women of today think? Do they want to join armies, fight wars?